Well, good evening and welcome to this month's edition of our cannabis conversation during COVID-19. For those of you who are just happen to hear that music coming in, there's a reason we are playing Men at Work. And for that, we'll introduce tonight's speaker and guest in just a short while. But let me take a moment to welcome everyone again from the digital world here. We have not had one of our cannabis conversations during COVID for a couple months. We're back. It's April 22nd, 2021. And again, my name is Dr. Timothy Fong, part of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative Steering Committee. We're so delighted to have our special guest here tonight. But before I introduce him and Dr. Cooper, just a quick summary of a few things that are happening here. Tonight's cannabis conversation during COVID-19 is brought to you by our UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, and we'll be discussing with Dr. Iain McGregor. Also, Dr. Ziva Cooper will be alongside asking questions and fielding questions from the audience. Please also be on the lookout for a few of the following things. We've rebranded our website at the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, and please take a look at the website for the latest on our staff, on our brand new research studies that we're starting, on recent events, and particularly on all the videos of all our cannabis conversations during COVID. Some of our other past symposiums are there as well. Here on this website, you can see we're welcoming in our brand new first ever UCLA Cannabis postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Stephanie Lake from Canada, but now of Los Angeles. We're so excited to have her here. Secondly, we have, of course, as a reminder, our own Twitter, our UCLA Cannabis Twitter. So please like us, join it, do whatever you need to do to expand our following. We don't have a blue check yet, but we certainly want to have one soon. Also brand new, Facebook. Like us on Facebook under UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, so please expand our following that way. Upcoming events, we have a Cannabis Grand Rounds with Dr. Lynn Silver of the Public Health Institute on June 17, 2021. So look for our website for registration and updates. But most importantly, coming up in about a month, on May 21st, we have our 4th annual UCLA Cannabis Research Symposium. Of course, it will be all virtual and digital, but we have about 3.5 hours of talks focusing on cannabis and pain, the impacts of COVID on cannabis use, population, patient care, and social equity, all highlighting UCLA faculty and researchers who've been doing work on cannabis. So this is the first ever all UCLA research initiative talking about cannabis. We're very excited about that. Without any further ado, let's introduce tonight's speaker. We're so pleased to welcome Dr. Iain McGregor from Sydney. He's a professor of psychopharmacology and the academic director of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics in the Brain and Mind Center at the University of Sydney. Right now in Australian Eastern Standard Time, it's the morning time. It's 10 a.m., so we're so excited. The Lambert Initiative is about 6 years old, and they were started off by a tremendous philanthropic gift for any of our potential listeners out there that looks to fast-track research on the therapeutic benefits of cannabinoids on medical disorders, mental health, and of course, athletic sports performance. One of the areas I'm most interested in is the question, is cannabis and athletic performance, does it help? Does it hurt? Is it a performance enhancer? Is it a performance detractor? I would be amiss not to highlight one of our highlights in athletic performance coming from UCLA over the last month, and that's, of course, our recent run to the Final Four. I cannot say whether that was fueled by cannabis. I shouldn't say that at all. But one of the questions to really ask is, what does cannabis do to our athletic and sport performance? We have a lot of wonderful questions, so we're going to get right into that. Let me go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Ziva Cooper, Director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, for the remainder of tonight's programming. And thank you, Dr. McGregor, for logging on all the way from the land down under.
Dr. Fong, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. We're so excited to have you join our series, Cannabis Conversations During COVID, highlighting the most pressing questions related to cannabis. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Iain McGregor about his work as the director of the Lambert Initiative based in Sydney, Australia, which is dedicated to investigating cannabinoids as therapeutics. Dr. McGregor has many interests and areas of expertise. Today, given the short time, we'll only be focusing on just a few of these. But by the end of today's conversation, we'll have learned about cannabis research in Australia, understanding the potential for some types of cannabis to be impairing and how long these effects last, and the intersection between cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, our body's natural cannabinoid system, and athletic performance. We at the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative look towards the Lambert Initiative as a model for how cannabis and cannabinoid scientific advancement can be achieved when there is strong collaborations between experts from a wide range of disciplines, from medicinal chemists to physicians. The Lambert Initiative has made landmark findings that have been really key to understanding the effects of cannabis on our brain and body in just a few short 6 years. For the conversation, we invite you to click on the tiles in the upper right corner of your screen to turn on the gallery view so you can see both of us at all times. And also feel free to add questions in the Q&A box. You might notice that I'm keeping an eye on this box during the conversation. We've already received a lot of questions for Dr. McGregor, and we're going to try our best to respond to all of these comments and questions over the course of the hour. So welcome, Dr. McGregor. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, focused on cannabis research down under, mental health, athletic performance, and next generation products.
Thank you, Ziva. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation to come along and speak to you today.
Next time we'll have you in person, Dr. McGregor.
I hope so.
Yes, definitely. So first, I just want to start off and ask you some questions about the Lambert Initiative and ask you about, some of the history and what the vision is for the Lambert Initiative. Because again, we definitely look towards the work that you do as inspiring, and the cross-disciplinary focus has been really instrumental in pushing the field forward. So when you started off the Lambert Initiative, what was your vision?
Well, the Lambert Initiative came along in a very unexpected way. And I've been doing cannabis research for probably about 20 years by that stage. And around about 2015, I attended a symposium that was very patient-centered. Australia was kind of lagged behind a little bit in terms of access to medicinal cannabis for patients. And so I got asked to go along and give a talk at a symposium in a country town in rural Australia. And there I just met this man who was a very interesting fellow, who was the father of a little girl with Dravet syndrome, which is a really severe form of pediatric epilepsy. And he was breaking the law, accessing cannabinoid products to treat his daughter very successfully. And then a couple of weeks later, he called me and introduced me to his parents, who are high net worth individuals. And they expressed a desire to set up a center for the study of medicinal cannabis and cannabinoids, and gave this incredibly generous gift to the University of Sydney to establish the Lambert Initiative. At that stage in my career, I was actually wondering what I was going to do next. We get this in academia, you think, well, I've kind of done that and I'm a bit bored with that, and what am I going to do? And I think there's maybe a lesson there for people that are in a flat spot in their careers, that you never know what's around the corner. So that meeting was transformational for my career, but more importantly for the whole field of medicinal cannabis in Australia, because it enabled us to hire an amazing team of people to pursue a research agenda that, as you've mentioned, is very wide. So we have an excellent medicinal chemistry team headed by Sam Bannister. They're coming up with new cannabinoid molecules. We've got a lot of cellular and animal models of disease. We run clinical trials, we do a lot of surveys, and we're also involved a lot in advocacy. So we get out in the community, talk to patients, and we take that to regulators and politicians and try to improve patient access. So it's a very broad brush that we paint with, and there's never a dull moment, and we try and have a huge amount of fun as we go along, if that's possible.
That's great. Yeah, so, and you mentioned that when you first met this family, they were essentially using cannabis illegally to help treat their daughter with Dravet. And Dravet, for people who don't know, is a severe form of epilepsy. And so right now, what is the state of cannabis regulatory status in Australia?
Well, the Lambert family were indeed ahead of their time. And one thing we do at the Lambert Initiative is to provide expert testimony in legal cases where people are being prosecuted who are using cannabis basically as a last resort because prescription medications have failed. And Mr. Lambert, Caitlin's father, was in exactly that position. He was importing CBD from Denmark and also growing a little bit. He was interested in the cannabinoid acids as treatments for epilepsy as well. So he was also growing some cannabis plants on his property. And the police came around, found the plants and arrested him. And so we provided expert testimony from our research, actually, that some of these acids had beneficial therapeutic effects in epilepsy. That's from our mouse model. But also at that point, CBD wasn't quite recognized as a valid therapeutic in Dravet. That happened much later. But we were able to point to the emerging evidence to say that what he was doing was quite rational and in fact ahead of its time. And so it proved when CBD became FDA approved for the very syndrome that Caitlin Lambert suffers from, Dravet syndrome.
Wow. And so what is it like now for patients and their providers, their care providers?
So in late 2016, the Australian government introduced legislation to allow access to medicinal cannabis products, but it required a special application to the equivalent of your FDA, our TGA. So every patient that wanted medicinal cannabis had to go to their doctor and persuade the doctor to make this specialized application to the regulator in order to get a permit for a prescription for cannabis. And this was incredibly frustrating and convoluted. Our doctors weren't trained on medicinal cannabis, so many of them were reluctant to engage in this process. And also it was very time consuming. And then what patients also find was if they managed to actually climb to the summit of that mountain and get a prescription, they could often not afford the product that was on offer, so incredibly expensive. So 2016, 2017, 2018 was a time of great frustration for patients. To their credit, the regulators and the government started listening to patients, and the Lambert Initiative was also very prominent in our advocacy. We were conducting surveys of people who were using cannabis medically in Australia, and we were finding that only 2% of them, for example, were getting legitimate prescription cannabis. The rest were using illegal cannabis. So it was obvious that the government scheme at that stage was not working, that really it wasn't delivering on its intent to provide access to patients. So they did a few things. There was a number of initiatives to educate doctors. They streamlined the online application process to get a permit. And the field became very vibrant in terms of the number of companies that had been set up to grow cannabis. And they became very strong patient advocacy voices as well as commercial voices. I mean, cannabis grows brilliantly in Australia. We've got a wonderful climate for it, and we're, a major agricultural exporter as a country. We're a bit of a food bowl for the world. And so, yeah, the conditions are excellent for cannabis growing. And so all of these things, I think, conspired to make the government think, wait a minute, we're maybe approaching this the wrong way. And we can maintain a system that is fairly rigorous and systematic and evidence-based, but we can also give medicinal cannabis the benefit of the doubt. So now we've had more than 100,000 approvals for medicinal cannabis prescriptions, and that's in a population of about 24 million. We have probably 50,000 patients. Our latest surveys, when we went out and looked at use of cannabis-based medicines in the community, it was about 2/3 to 1/3 using illegal, which is a huge advance on where it was before, 98% to 2%. So things are getting better. The products are still quite expensive, but it's much more common for doctors to be aware of medicinal cannabis and also for patients to be asking for it. And now we're kind of working through the evidence base to see, which cannabinoid's best for which condition. But in some ways, the rigorous nature of the system that we've established in Australia has been a positive, because the cannabis that's been grown here is top quality, is quality assured, the education has been fairly good of doctors as it exists so far. And I think the debate has been quite mature as well in the media around medicinal cannabis. So I think we're quite well poised to move into the future with quite a successful program, but it's taken a while to get there.
Right, and you talk about the supply issue, and I think one thing that, if you're in Los Angeles, there does not seem to be a supply issue, and there's lots of different varieties of products, and we have products that are can be smoked or inhaled, vaporized. There are products that can rub on your skin, products that you can drip under your tongue. Is it the same system in Australia where patients are presented with an array of different types of products and the physician kind of has to help guide the patient in some fashion as to what they should take for some indication or another indication?
Yes, we actually have 190 products available to our 50,000 patients. So if anything, it's quite bamboozling for the doctors to know which of the 190, which one they should prescribe for a given condition. And you would know very well, Ziva, that we're still kind of working out the relationship between different products and different conditions and how to manage that. So, I mean, overwhelmingly, patients are using oral products. So oils are the most common, capsules, sprays. We've got wafers now that are proving quite popular. And about 16% of prescriptions are for botanicals. So we do have people vaporizing, particularly patients with chronic pain. And there's a lot of innovation actually with formulations. We talk a lot to the industry, and for example, with CBD, there's a lot of interest in how to improve its bioavailability, and people are talking about, nasal preparations, suppositories, putting in special sauce that will improve the gastric permeability of CBD or to help it get into the brain. So the Australians are very crafty. There's all sorts of innovation and riffing going on in the sector.
And it sounds like the government has kind of recognized the fact that patients are using these products, and the physicians, it sounds like physicians are on board with having an open dialogue with patients, even though there might not be that rigorous double-blind placebo-controlled evidence yet. So I'm wondering, in the United States, one thing that we hear a lot about is that research is hindered because of the fact that cannabis, even though it's legal in almost all of the United States at this point on a federal level, it's not legal, but it sounds like maybe in your situation in Australia that the government is more on board with research in Australia. Is that the case, or do you still deal with some of these barriers that we deal with in the United States?
I mean, there still are barriers. I mean, there's no systematic doctor education program. The one major barrier has been the medical colleges. The specialist colleges have been very skeptical. We've surveyed GPs, your primary care physicians, and they tend to be quite supportive because I think they're in the front line and seeing how opioids and benzodiazepines and gabapentinoids often fail, and they're looking for alternatives. But when you get into pain specialists, anesthesiologists, we did a survey of gastroenterologists recently, and they all seem rather skeptical. And we, sometimes have open warfare with the colleges because the Lambert Initiative is trying to point out the positives and also point out that patients are going to use this regardless of whether it's legal or illegal. And it's preferable that it be legal because then you've got quality assurance of products. But that message doesn't always land. I mean, there was a paper just came out in the Medical Journal of Australia this week with an editorial. They'd run a study of CBD in acute back pain, and it didn't work, which wasn't a big surprise. No one would really take CBD if they had back pain severe enough to go to an emergency department, which was what the study was based on. So, we've had a bit of a robust debate with pain physicians just this week around that particular study. And, the patients all had opioids and paracetamol and ibuprofen on board before they were given the CBD, and they all had pain of 8 out of 10 and really that's not the context to put CBD into. So it's a bit of a silly study in the first place, although it wasn't RCT. So we're always debating the specialist colleges. We've got the GPs largely on side, but the specialists, I just wonder sometimes if cannabis isn't a bit of a disruptor to their business model, and that's what we're up against.
Mm-hmm. So, Iain, you just mentioned this really curious study where CBD was given for acute, severe back pain, and how it didn't seem justified. So, taking a step back for a second, when we talk about CBD, in your perspective, so CBD is the non-intoxicating component of the cannabis plant. And it's been shown in animal studies to help with certain types of pain, with certain models of pain. But it seems like in humans, it hasn't really been determined if CBD, cannabidiol by itself, can be helpful for the types of pain that people are taking it. And so certainly here, for severe acute pain, which I think, a lot of people in our audience right now, they're probably thinking, they've seen advertisements that CBD might actually be helpful for acute pain. So because you're so immersed in this field, I think a lot of people are wondering, what type of pain can CBD be helpful for? Are you guys looking into this at all? Like, is it chronic pain, long lasting pain? Is there a certain way that people can use it that might be more effective, or do we just not know yet?
I think the latter. We're still trying to find out, and that's why it was so disappointing, that trial during the week, because it was really the first RCT of CBD in pain. And what a good study would have looked like would have been people with stable, chronic back pain. By our surveys, about 12% of Australians are using medicinal cannabis for that very reason, for lower back pain.
Wait, 12% of Australians?
12% of Australians using medicinal cannabis are
for lower back pain. Oh, wow.
Are using it for lower back pain. So it's a major indication. It's up there with anxiety, insomnia, fibromyalgia, arthritis, but probably third in our data set. But if there's an acute exacerbation of back pain, you wouldn't use CBD in that context. What you'd be looking for is kind of stable chronic dosing, and you would hope that you would get a signal that may well be on the pain itself, but maybe in the cluster of other symptoms that surround chronic pain. So that things like anxiety, things like insomnia, quality of life. We believe strongly from the preclinical literature that there is an actual signal on pain, that it's probably related more to inflammation than anything else. There's very strong anti-inflammatory effects of CBD. And we're just launching actually a study at the moment in people with spinal cord injuries, looking at very high doses of CBD. Now, I didn't know this until we set up the study, but about half of people who suffer a spinal cord injury have terrible pain that accompanies that injury. You would think, they can't feel their limbs anymore, but this is like a phantom pain that is generated within their nervous system, a form of neuropathic pain, which many of them rate as more distressing than the disability itself. About 50% of spinal cord injury patients have this. So we're intervening quite aggressively with high doses of CBD based on animal literature that basically this kind of phantom pain reflects an inflammatory condition in the nervous system, and that CBD may be able to reduce that inflammation and take away their pain. And we're combining dosing with CBD with a lot of neural imaging. So we're doing MRI imaging that will let us look at that particular hypothesis around inflammatory processes in key parts of the brain. So this is very exciting. And, we like to go into areas where there's great unmet need and where suffering is maximal. This is one of the principles of the Lambert Initiative, because obviously children with Dravet have this terrible condition that isn't helped by conventional prescription medication. So that's something we carry with us. And spinal cord injury is obviously one where we'd love to make a difference if possible.
And do you think, first I want to ask you about when you say high doses of CBD, what type of doses are you talking about?
Well, we're up about 800, and and this is another issue. I think the dosing of CBD is fantastically interesting, and as you know, in America and Europe, you've got shops full of CBD products that might give you an oral dose of 15 to maybe 150 milligrams. And we've reviewed the literature, and there's nothing much happening in terms of evidence at 15 to 150, but I've seen the estimates that 1 in 7 Americans have tried CBD over the counter, and we're about to get over the counter CBD in Australia as well. That's another win for patient access that's happened quite recently with our government. So the race is on in Australia, actually, to try and find evidence that these low doses do something useful. And we're about to launch a study which is aimed at kind of grumpy middle-aged people like myself to give them low doses of CBD and see whether it improves. The primary outcomes insomnia, but we'll also be looking at mood. We'll be taking blood and looking at endocannabinoid function, inflammatory markers, and a whole raft of outcomes. And that will be probably the first large RCT, randomized controlled trial, of low-dose CBD that we're aware of with insomnia as the focus.
So you'll be looking at lower doses of CBD that are available in dispensaries, let's say about 50 milligrams, and comparing it to placebo, which is different than the spinal cord injury one where you're giving 800 milligrams orally and you're comparing that to placebo.
Exactly right. We have a number of clinical trials at that high dose range. We just finished a youth anxiety trial, which got a very positive outcome, where we've greatly reduced anxiety in severely anxious young people with 800 milligrams of CBD. We have a very large phase 3 we're involved in with people in Melbourne, looking at ultra high risk of psychosis. These are young people that look like they may be developing schizophrenia. And we're going to intervene with 600 or 1,000 milligrams of CBD there.
So really high dose of CBD. And what about other parts of the plant, Iain? Are there other parts of the plant that you think might be helpful for pain, specifically, since we're talking about pain or insomnia, which you mentioned? What about, THC, which is the intoxicating part of the cannabis plant? Do you think the THC might be helpful there as well? Or do you think that THC is kind of limited because it is intoxicating?
I think THC is somewhat demonized. I think there's a lot that's therapeutically useful about THC. One of the clinical trials we're involved in at the moment is in Tourette syndrome. And if you talk to people with Tourette's, they really need THC. I mean, if they're experimenting themselves, CBD doesn't quite do it, whereas THC has quite a dramatic effect on their tics. And so that trial will be delivering results probably in 3 or 4 months' time, and we're very hopeful there'll be a THC effect there. Pain, I don't think there's any shadow of a doubt that THC has a special effect on pain that's quite different to what you see with CBD. I'm very interested in low-dose THC as well. There may well be a different threshold for the therapeutic effects of THC versus the intoxicating effects. And there's certainly some very interesting preclinical literature suggesting that ultra low doses of THC may have beneficial effects. There's another 138 cannabinoids in the plant to look at. And in a way, I'm just so bored with THC and CBD, and I want to get on to the ones that are lower down the list, and we do a lot of work there.
Right. And so hopefully we're going to get to that at the end. There were some questions about some of, the product development and therapeutic development of these other cannabinoids that we got from the audience members. But I want to move to this THC part because I think it's important. Some of your work recently has looked at the impairing effects of cannabis and also the duration of the impairment. And so you and your colleagues just published this incredible paper where you actually looked at the impact of cannabis smoking, or maybe it was vaporizing, inhaling, I'll put it that way, inhaling cannabis on driving performance, and you actually did roadside assessments, or not roadside, you did on the road assessments where you had people driving, which is the first type of study of its kind, where you had people using cannabis and actually looking at performance. So what did you find with that study?
Well, this was a great study that was done by my grad student, Tom Arkell, and we collaborated with some Dutch friends, Jan Reemakers and his group in Maastricht, to do this study. And I remember taking this idea along to our management group. All our funding has to be approved by a management group. And I said, you know what, we're going to give healthy volunteers vaporized cannabis, and then we're going to put them in a car and let them go out and drive around for a couple of 100 kilometers. And the management committee basically fell off their chairs with laughter. You did what? They thought it was hilarious. But the Dutch are very pragmatic. The Dutch people basically are into finding things out in a very practical way. So we were able to go to Maastricht and run the study, and they did an incredible job. So we had people vaporize different types of cannabis, THC dominant, CBD dominant, or one-to-one THC, CBD, or placebo cannabis, and then they went out for a drive. And basically the most important punchline was probably that CBD didn't impair driving, and no one had shown that before. And it was a real issue for patients. Here in Australia, some patients were being told by the doctors, even on CBD, that they couldn't drive. We have roadside drug testing in Australia, where you can be randomly stopped as you're driving and tested, and your saliva tested for the presence of cannabinoids. So this is a real issue for our medicinal cannabis patients, and that's what was driving, no pun intended, our interest in this area. So the Dutch study was important in showing that CBD didn't impair driving, but also that THC, there was a kind of window of impairment. We could see quite clear impairment at 1 hour, but not 4 hours after vaporizing THC. And also, if you added CBD to THC, it didn't really get rid of that THC impairment. So there was no mitigation by CBD or THC's impairing effects, although anxiety went down a little bit when you added CBD to THC in that study. So that was a really important set of outcomes. But obviously, there was only a single dose of THC we used in the Dutch study. And it became important to try and better define that window of impairment. And this also related to a legal case I was involved in Canada as an expert witness. Obviously, in Canada, you can freely use cannabis recreationally as well as medically. And for employers, there's real safety issues. If you're working the transportation issue, there's a real issue of, if your bus driver is using cannabis by night, are they fit to drive the bus in the morning? And there's quite a lot of legal activity in Canada around this, with unions facing off against employers on cannabis-related issues. So all the credit for this meta-analysis goes to Danielle McCartney, who's quite an exceptional postdoc in the Lambert group. And she was locked up for a little while during COVID and looking for something to do. So I said, well, find every study that's ever been done on duration of impairment with cannabis and feed them through a mathematical model and give us the punchline. And so that's the study that was published last week that you're referring to, which is a meta-analysis involving about 80 studies that Danielle found, and showed that basically duration of impairment depends upon dose of THC. Higher doses, you get longer impairment. It depends upon whether you use it orally or inhale it. So inhaled, the impairment comes on more quickly and disappears more rapidly. And also whether you're experienced or not. So generally, if you're an experienced cannabis user, or a daily or regular user, your impairment will be substantially less than if you're an occasional user. So kind of the worst case scenario, a really high dose of THC in an inexperienced user, taken orally, you're probably out there about 10 hours. But more typical dosing, the THC inhaled in a modest dose, it'd be 3 to 4 hours, and probably less if you're an experienced user.
So what are those implications for people who are using THC for medical purposes? I mean, to have the data that shows us that, if you're inhaling small amounts of THC or moderate doses of THC and essentially you're impaired for 3 hours, um, were the people in those studies, were they people who are using cannabis medically, or were they mostly people who are using cannabis non-medically? Do you think it matters? Do you think that you would see differences in impairment if somebody was using cannabis for medical purposes versus non-medical purposes?
That's an excellent point, and that's our next study. So, much in the same way as it's very puzzling. There was no controlled trials of CBD in pain. There's been really no properly controlled trials of driving in medicinal cannabis patients, and it's so important because if you think about it, if you have a chronic pain condition, that is going to impair your driving. If you're racked with pain and driving down to the shops, you're going to probably not drive as well as if you're pain-free. So there's actually an opportunity there to show that cannabis might improve driving in patients, or at least have a null effect. And so that's a study that we're crafting at the moment. We're trying to get a study designed together that will look at this. And there's a few complications. You want to get people right at the beginning of their medicinal cannabis journey, rather than people that are very experienced with THC. And you also want to have healthy controls. So you've got to wonder what they look like and how you fit that into your design. But we've identified this as probably the most important clinical trial in our driving research moving forward, to actually do one in patients who are initiating THC therapy.
Absolutely. And I also wonder just, how impairment from THC might compare to other therapeutics that people are using.
Absolutely.
So for instance, opioids or, benzodiazepines, if there's a similar rate.
We have this argument with the authorities all the time in Australia because, you can take 50 milligrams of diazepam and go out driving, go for a long drive.
And diazepam is something to help with anxiety.
Yes.
Valiant thinking.
Yeah,
and you
or
can just
still
go out
not.
and drive afterwards.
And there's no doubt that these drugs are heavily impairing, and the crash risk is much greater for them than with cannabis. In fact, cannabis is funny, its effects on driving. It's certainly not like alcohol. You've got a modestly increased crash risk, maybe sort of 1.2 to 1.4 fold. And on some measures, people on cannabis are driving more safely. So they tend to leave a longer distance between themselves and the car in front. And they tend to drive more slowly as well. My hypothesis is it's just been something, very demanding happens very quickly. That may be when impairment is most evident. But there's been very large studies that have sometimes found no increased crash risk with cannabis at all. So it's not what you think it is.
Right. So going down that impairment, road, thinking about athletes using cannabis, and I think 10 or 15 years ago, we would have thought that cannabis is definitely not what you would want to combine with a athletic endeavor. But surely, we started seeing Olympic athletes saying that they were using cannabis while, they were snowboarding or swimming. And now, as Dr. Fong pointed out, I mean, this is something that we hear about all the time, that professional athletes, recreational athletes are using cannabis or some type of cannabis product to help with athletic performance. And there was a survey that just came out, or a population-based study that just came out a couple weeks ago, that showed that people who are using cannabis are not the lazy stereotype that we once thought they were. They're actually more active and more athletically inclined than the control group or the people who weren't using cannabis. So I know you guys have done a little bit of work in this area. So what do you think? The stereotype of cannabis users being lazy and not active, fact or fiction? What have you guys seen?
Well, the idea of cannabis users being lazy typically comes from a laboratory study where they're taken into the lab and they're told to, say, press a space bar on a computer keyboard 200 times and they'll get $1 for and cannabis users basically say, what? I'm not going to waste my time doing that. Whereas non-cannabis users will be very well behaved. And so I think basically that's been one of the reasons that we've been misled about the lazy stereotype, that they tend to be a little bit more lateral. I think cannabis users, maybe slightly more creative and make different choices about what they're going to do. Sometimes a little bit rebellious in terms of, no, I'm not going to press that stupid space bar 200 times. Why would I want to do that? So there is that. We're kind of in the foothills of our work on cannabis and sporting performance. There's a number of themes that we're very interested in. This work, again, was led by Danielle McCartney, who has a background in sports and exercise science. And she did a systematic review of CBD in sports, which basically said there's all sorts of anecdotal evidence and there's all sorts of preclinical evidence that suggests CBD may be pretty good if you're an elite sports person. And certainly we're seeing, Bubba Watson in golf, we're seeing every English rugby player all taking CBD without much evidence that it does anything useful yet. So we just finished a little pilot of 300 milligrams of CBD in some endurance athletes. And it was quite a fun study that Danielle did with her grad student, Aishi. And we brought these athletes in and they had to run on a treadmill for 60 minutes and then they had a little rest and then we ran them to exhaustion. So basically we increased the gradient on the treadmill and saw how long they lasted, both on placebo and then with CBD at 300. And it was only a small study with N equals 10, and we're going to do a much bigger version of the study soon. But we found, I think, 3 different things. Number one was that on CBD, they enjoyed their exercise much more. So the ratings of pleasure while we were flogging them to exhaustion were perversely, increased by CBD. So that was really quite unexpected. We also found that their time to exhaustion was longer on CBD. That didn't quite make statistical significance, and we'll hopefully get more insight. But they lasted about 40 seconds longer as the gradient went up. So that was interesting. And then we found effects on oxygen consumption with CBD as well, where oxygen consumption is actually increased. And we're not quite sure what the physiological mechanism is behind that. We think it might reflect vasodilation, but we're going to look into that further. We did quite a comprehensive analysis of inflammation, and exercise, if you go hard, can cause an increase in cytokines and all sorts of inflammatory mediators. And we found CBD was a bit protective against this inflammatory response to exercise. So that was really interesting, and it's something that we're going to take forward into a much larger study. If there's time, I can tell you a couple of other things we're doing in exercise.
Yes, I want to ask you a couple of questions though. Did you ask the participants how they felt the next day or the day after with respect to, you hear about this muscle soreness that people have after they exercise, and how a lot of people are using CBD after they exercise to help alleviate any type of post-exercise muscle soreness and fatigue?
I believe we did check in with them 24 hours later, but I can't remember what we found. I might have to get back to you on that one. But yes, we certainly, the inflammatory response being reduced by CBD might actually correlate with there being less of a day after effect. And certainly, amongst elite athletes and the rugby players I mentioned in the UK, that's the number one reason for CBD use. They think that it facilitates exercise recovery.
And Iain, this was just CBD. There was no THC in there.
No, that's right. I mean, there has been work done, I'm sure you're aware of it, with THC. Historically, there's been studies in the 70s, and there's basically not much of an effect. I mean, in laboratory studies, we might revisit that literature and do the equivalent study with THC, because the setup we've developed is really good, and you can do all sorts of measurements and all sorts of fancy things that weren't possible during these early studies in the 70s and 80s.
That would be great, because there's some questions from the audience that are very much relevant, but please tell us about some of the other work that you're doing in this field.
Yeah, well, we have another sports theme with concussion. So obviously it's a huge issue in your NFL and our NRL here in Australia, our rugby, and also in soccer as well. There seems to be a correlation between heading a soccer ball and ending up with dementia in later life. So we have a study that just started, actually, or just about to start, where we're quite deliberately firing soccer balls at people's heads. Sorry, that makes it sound a bit dramatic, but you can buy this special cannon that launches soccer balls. And so we're going to get some soccer players and get them to head the ball probably 20 times in 20 minutes. And then we're going to take them into a brain scanner and use a technology called MRS to look for evidence of sort of a neurotoxic response to that kind of subconcussive head impact that the soccer ball provides. And we'll also look at a range of inflammatory markers as well. Now, the reason for that is to then, if we can find a signal that looks a little bit like it's associated with neurotrauma, then we might see if CBD can have a neuroprotective effect, because as I'm sure you're aware, there's lots of preclinical evidence of CBD being protective in models of stroke and brain injury. So that's one of the other things we're doing. And the final thing I wanted to mention with sports is that obviously a red hot issue is drug testing, and the World Doping Authority's pronouncements around cannabis. And one study we're doing is looking at people that are taking over-the-counter CBD supplements, some of which are not pure CBD isolate. They often have, trace levels of other cannabinoids. And so the WADA rules are fine for CBD. It's not prohibited. THC, you can have up to 150 nanograms in your urine, which is quite generous. But we're actually interested in other phytocannabinoids like CBG and CBN, for example, which conceivably could get athletes into a lot of trouble because WADA are quite strict on them. So that's a study we're doing with some UK collaborators at the moment. So sports is interesting. I mean, we do a lot of work in very serious illnesses, in cancer and epilepsy and pain. But the sporting stuff has mass appeal, and it's tremendously interesting. And again, we're kind of backfilling the evidence that's out there. People are using CBD all the time in sports, but without any evidence whatsoever. So backfilling that evidence is quite an important pursuit.
So it's interesting. So we have a question, or I guess a comment from one of the audience members who says, I'm 66, a high mileage cyclist with joint pains, and I haven't found any benefit from CBD, whether smoking, vaporizing, edibles, or topicals. And so I think the audience member is explaining that they've tried this, but they haven't seen any effect from it. So what do you think is going on here?
Well, I think we have this honeymoon with CBD. I mean, it's. What did the New York Times article say? Can CBD really do all that? So there's not a condition that CBD hasn't been sort of advertised as being able to treat. So we've got the kind of shakeout happening at the moment. And another thing may be that there's huge individual differences. So some people are very poor at absorbing CBD. We don't understand the mechanisms through which CBD has anti-inflammatory and anti-pain effects. So it could be that some people are just better responders than others. And you find that with all medicines, as you know. I mean, my introduction to CBD in sports came when I think it was in America, and someone said, oh, you might want to try this 15 milligram CBD capsule. And I took it. I just happened to be playing tennis that afternoon, and I'm a very poor tennis player, even on a good day. And for some reason, I played out of my skin after. It could well have been a placebo effect, but there was something psychological there, which I would probably say was optimism. It was like optimism in a pill, because it's very easy to get into a loser mentality in sport and think, well, I lost that point and I'm going to lose this game, I'm going to lose the set, and I'm going to lose the match. And I think I find CBD, it could well be placebo, but I find it useful for injecting a little bit of optimism into outcomes.
But I think, Iain, also another important point is related to the study that you just finished, where participants, they were on the treadmill and apparently they enjoyed this, the torture that you put them through, increasing the incline every 5 minutes, but you also gave them 300 milligrams of oral CBD.
Yes, yeah.
Which probably goes into whether people are going to have an effect or not have an effect is the dose. Dose is really important, as well as, what's in that bottle. In the United States, frequently products aren't tested the same way that it sounds like in Australia they're tested. So the dose is probably really important too.
Exactly right. I mean, it's 300 is a generous dose. The new study we're doing will compare 15, 300 and 1500 or 1000. We're not quite sure whether we'll go with 1000. One of the problems with 1500 is we can still detect it in people's plasma about 30 days later. A single dose of CBD at 1500, you'll be able to detect for weeks afterwards, wow. Much like THC. So that this is a new complication we have in our CBD laboratory studies and clinical trials, which we discovered quite recently.
Wow, that is an extended period of time, and presumably it's because it's stored in the fat of your body.
Yes, that's right, and we've shown that with THC that the joint you smoked a few weeks ago can come back to haunt you if you burn fat.
I wanted to get to that story too. I don't know if we're gonna have time, because on the flip side, we have an audience member who says that CBD or cannabis is actually very beneficial. She says, or he says, I need cannabis to exercise long and hard enough for a healthy effect. But smoking is very irritating to the throat. So this audience member is actually smoking cannabis and seeing the benefits for that person on their athletic performance, but it's irritating for the throat. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think with pulmonary absorption of cannabinoids, you have a possible advantage of vasodilation. And I think you did a conversation around respiratory function that probably underlined that THC can have bronchodilatory effects. So you may actually improve your oxygen consumption with vaporized cannabis, but I can never recommend smoking because that pyrolysis puts all sorts of nasty, smoky, carcinogenic things in your lungs. Not that there is a statistical association between cannabis smoking and lung cancer, but there is a link with bronchitis. So you're better off vaping than smoking.
So here's another interesting question. Well, first of all, the study that you just completed with CBD use or CBD administration while people are on the treadmill, has that been published yet, or will it be forthcoming?
It will be forthcoming. We're just putting the finishing touches to it at the moment. It was completed just before Christmas. Then we had to wait for a while. We looked at 40 different inflammatory markers. Oh my gosh. And it took a while to sift through that data. That was a big data exercise, but we should be submitting in the next week or so. And
amazing.
I'll keep you posted.
Well, Iain, we'll be sure to post it on our website too. So here's an interesting question that you probably have not gotten before. Are there any military uses or experiences with cannabinoids or CBD? Perhaps there's great positive and also negative ramifications. Do you know of any literature where cannabinoids have been used in the military?
Well, I think they played around with it as a truth drug for a while, but they found that barbiturates and ecstasy were probably better. But I think the one area that's fantastically important is neurotrauma. So the number of people in the military that suffer concussion on one end of the scale, but horrible brain injuries with shrapnel and bullets on the other end. I think there should be a lot of research in that. I'm kind of wondering, going back to our CBD treadmill study, if it does prove to be effective in terms of time to exhaustion, I guess we're going to face WADA coming in and banning CBD, because that will be the illustration of a performance enhancing effect of CBD. So I guess it might be a case of get it while you can.
Right. So we're just about to wrap up, Iain. This was so much fun talking to you. I want to ask you if you have any closing statements regarding the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, any take-home points that you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, in a way, the most exciting stuff I haven't been able to talk about because there's so much, to digest just with the status quo. But the next 4 years, I think, are going to be very exciting. In the Lambert Initiative, at least half of our team are working on preclinical projects. We're doing a lot of work with the minor phytocannabinoids, so things other than THC and CBD. We have clinical trials later this year into CBN, which we're going to be looking at in relation to insomnia. CBG is also of great interest for inflammatory conditions, so that's happening. But there's a whole bunch of cannabinoids you haven't heard of yet that are showing some remarkable therapeutic potential in our cellular and animal models. And we're even playing around. Our medicinal chemists are so excellent. They can take a cannabinoid like CBG and play around with its chemical structure to make it even better at what it does therapeutically. So we have some novel chemical entities that are inspired by cannabinoids that are also showing really promising effects. So in many ways with cannabinoid therapeutics, we're just at the beginning, we're just in the foothills, and there's really interesting mountains to climb.
Well, we're so excited to see the research coming out of the Lambert Initiative, and hopefully we can have you in Los Angeles at some point in time. It would be really wonderful to see you in person.
Yeah, I love California. It's like a slightly more populated Australia. But,
right.
I'll look forward to the next time I see you, Ziva. And thanks very much for the opportunity today. It was great fun talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to take the time to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. And of course, to Dr. McGregor for your insightful questions, and to the SEML staff and audiovisual team for helping us with the technology, and the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative staff for organizing this event. As you know, this programming is free and open to the community, which we do intentionally. The UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative does rely heavily on philanthropic support to conduct cutting-edge research, hopefully one day as extensive as the Lambert Initiative, and educational programs. Our goal is for you to find our webinars educational and insightful, and that they provide important information to the community about the potential therapeutic and adverse effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. You'll soon be seeing a follow-up email from us where you'll have a link to this webinar so you can share it with your friends. And we'll include donation information for your consideration to support the good work we do at the Cannabis Research Initiative. And your participation in these events and your support are incredibly important and valuable to us, and we sincerely appreciate both your time and generosity and your very insightful questions. And we look forward to having you join us on May 21st. Mark your calendars, May 21st, 9 to 12:30 Pacific time, for our annual event where we'll be highlighting the research that is happening at UCLA. Until then, stay healthy and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.